Turn this over to you, the students, fellows, professors here. My only suggestions would be that when you ask the question, why don't you rise and state your name, if you're a student here, what school, what you're studying, and make sure that that question has a question mark attached to the end of it. But let me call on first on Professor Kaiser, who teaches at the Kennedy School and who is present at the creation of German unification.
Mr. Secretary, as a German, but now also as an American citizen, there's no aspect that impresses us as much as the fact to which you referred. The Cold War could have ended in a bloodbath, and it didn't. And considering, having lived there at the time, that nowhere else in the world was there such a concentration of military power as there, one soldier shooting would have changed the course. It didn't happen.
Yeah.
And we owe a great deal to your leadership and the President's leadership at that time. Now, my question refers to what has rightly been considered the central achievement, to get Germany unified in NATO. And that was considered also, when I think back of the discussions in Bonn, the central problem. Of course, you had an ally, and who had to help on that, namely Helmut Kohl, the government. You will remember there was a debate, should there be a new constitution? Should there be a constituent assembly? And that was just eliminated. East Germany joined West Germany.
That's right.
That was crucial.
Yeah.
That meant joined the West, joined NATO, joined the European community. That was automatic. That was very crucial that there was a majority for that. But still, there were all the factors that you mentioned that in the end turned Gorbachev around. But there's still one, and you briefly referred to it, and I would like to ask you about it. That specter of neutrality. The fear that if you didn't unify Germany inside NATO, a different Germany would emerge with a totally different implication for the European structure of states. How did you use it? I do remember it once, I think you used the argument, wouldn't a neutral Germany then try to get nuclear weapons?
We did use that.
What did it in the end? That specter.
Well, of course, we broached that issue, the potential Germany, a neutral Germany in the heart of Europe. We broached that subject directly with Gorbachev. We said, you know, we think you would be better off with Germany in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization with restraints on NATO troops on the territory of the German Democratic Republic than you would be with a neutral Germany in the heart of Europe. And I think they finally began to believe that themselves. But we had these two concerns. First, we had the concern that a unified Germany could turn east. They could cut some deals with Poland. They could conceivably cut some with the Soviet Union. But when Kohl gave us his word, we relied on it, and he took steps to reconfirm our belief in our reliance. But there was never any assurance that Germany might not be neutral. But I think we sold Gorbachev on the risks that would be involved in that. And there would have been risks. But once we made our deal February 24th at Camp David, I never saw any indication from any West German leader, that anybody wanted to see a neutral Germany in the heart of Europe, which would have been a force for instability.
Just one quick question based on Carl's question. You used the word trust with Helmut Kohl. You were President Reagan's chief of staff when President Reagan famously said, trust but verify. Was there that element of trust between you and Shevardnadze and Gorbachev and President Bush? Did you develop that during this crisis?
We did. We developed very good personal relationships. When I mentioned earlier about one of the important aspects of negotiation, I think is if you can develop a relationship of trust with your interlocutor. I had a really close personal relationship, and still do, with Shevardnadze, and I found out that I could trust him. I knew when he was posturing for his generals and his intelligence services and so forth, but I never had any occasion where he broke his word to me, or where he did anything contrary to what he had told me he would do or wouldn't do. And I was in the same way with him. And President Bush ended up having that same kind of relationship with Gorbachev. That makes getting things done a hell of a lot easier.
Thank you. Other questions? Sir, Josh.
Sir, Josh Shifrinson. I'm a Kennedy Belfer Center Fellow for the
Speak
year.
up.
Sorry, Josh Shifrinson, Belfer Center Fellow for the year. Sir, I have two related questions. Thanks. One, we've made a lot about the fear of backlash coming from the USSR at various points in time in the reunification process. Could you just say a little bit how we thought that process would play out? It seems that the Soviets are quite weak economically, as you pointed out. Gorbachev is under pressure at home. The Eastern Bloc as a whole is falling apart. What did we imagine the blowback would look like? That's one question. And then
Blowback on from what?
Well,
You want to restate your question?
well, you're emphasizing the risk of a crackdown in East Germany. How is that going to go if the Eastern Bloc itself is falling by the wayside throughout this period? The Soviets are weak. They're dependent. They're increasingly calling for economic aid from the West.
This question? Because you can translate.
So in other words, was there a realistic possibility that there could have been the use of force by either East Germany or the Soviet Union in the early stages of this?
That's right. And
That was
when-
one thing to think
The
about.
answer to that, in my view, is no. I don't think there was any possibility that the Soviets were going to use force to maintain their position in East Germany unless we had decided, for instance, that we were going to move forcefully in some way. I think Gorbachev and Shevardnadze and others were trying to change the face of socialism, communism, if you will, in the Soviet Union. And they made a fundamental determination at some point that they were simply not going to use force to keep the empire together. I remember when Honecker went out and made some statement in East Germany, and Gorbachev said, look, East German policy is not determined in Moscow, it's determined in Berlin.
Right.
Remember that?
That was just before November 9th, just
Yeah.
before us. Yeah. Josh, your second question.
Right. Very briefly, if Germany was neutralized, if it was an independent actor in Europe, and/or if it cut deals with the Soviets akin to Rapallo, what did you see as the risks for the United States in those scenarios?
If Germany were neutral in the heart of Europe,
Yes, that's right.
what do I see as the risk to the United States?
That's right.
Well, you have the potential then for that neutral Germany to develop nuclear weapons, to align itself with bad actors all around the world. They would not be in treaty obligations with the United States and the West. Those are all the kinds of things that could have happened. But I really don't think there was much chance that was going to happen. I mean, Helmut Kohl didn't have any interest in that happening, nor did Genscher or anybody in the government of the Federal Republic of Germany, nor the East Germans for that matter.
Interesting. Other questions? Yes. Right here in the third row. We need to see more students with hands raised, or else we'll call on you.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your great insights, especially regarding the successful German reunification. My name is Grace Choi, and I'm a second-year Master's of Arts in Law and Diplomacy student at the Fletcher School. My question is in regards to when you look at some of the things that are coming out of the Korean academic community, a lot of people who are interested in the reunification of the Korean Peninsula look towards German unification. Look towards German unification as a successful case to learn from. And I'm wondering if you could possibly provide some, maybe 2 or 3 negotiation strategies and tools that you feel like are transferable from the German unification case to cases like Korea or other nation states that are interested in multilateral negotiations.
That's a good question. Thank you.
Right.
I'll just
Thank
restate
you.
it.
Yeah.
So as you reflect on the lessons of German unification,
Yeah.
there's another big issue out there. You were in the Marine Corps during this war. The Korean War ended in armistice.
Right.
If there's going to be in the future a unification
Yeah.
of the Koreans, of the two Koreas, are there lessons in how you negotiated German unification that might apply to this current situation?
Well, I think there are lessons that could apply to unification on the Korean Peninsula. You have a somewhat different situation because in German unification you had East Germany, which was a vassal state of the Soviet Union. On the Korean Peninsula, you got a terrible government in North Korea, a really flaky regime, and they're hard enough. They're very difficult to deal with. But still, you're going to be faced with some of the same problems. You don't have four-power occupation and all of this. And the two Koreas are going to have to be the ones that negotiate their unification. But North Korea is going to want to know that it's got the United States involved in that and behind that. China, of course, is the only country that has any influence whatsoever on North Korea. They don't want to see North Korea blow up in instability that will send millions of hundreds of thousands of refugees across their borders. So China could play a very important role in this. But the issues are not all that different. You have a terrible disparity economically between North and South, just like you had a terrible disparity economically. Korea, I mean, how can you negotiate with those people? Have some of the same issues. But first, you can't even start thinking about unification until you get a regime that's not so flaky in North Korea. I mean, how can you negotiate with those people? You can't. I mean, I'm one of these people who believes you talk to everybody. If you know what you're doing, you're not running any risk by talking. And as long as you're tough, you talk to your enemies. You don't negotiate peace with your friends. You negotiate peace with your enemies. But I don't know anybody who's had any success whatsoever in talking to North Korea. You know, we do it all the time. We're about to hear, we're on the cusp of doing it again. We send them humanitarian aid and everything, and then they don't do what they say they were going to do. It happens over and over and over and over again. So I don't hold out a lot of prospect for anything in the short to medium term happening there, but the issues will be the same.
You talked about negotiating with your enemies. I saw you on Charlie Rose the other night, and he asked you about Iran.
Yeah.
And whether or not you thought that President Obama was right in seeking negotiations.
Yes.
Do you want to repeat that?
I think President Obama is right on the money in terms of how we ought to react to the Iranian nuclear program that we think is coming. I don't think there's a lot of difference between the American government and the Israeli government on this issue. In my view, the difference is one of when and who. We simply cannot have an Iran with nuclear weapons. Not so much because of the threat that they'll attack us or Europe or even Israel, but because of the proliferation threat that this would trigger. Then the whole Middle East is going to go nuclear. Turkey will feel she has to have the bomb, Egypt and so forth, Saudi Arabia. So we can't let that happen. And if we had to use military assets to prevent it from happening, we could, at the point at which they weaponize. And we're the ones that have the capability of doing that. We have a much better capacity and capability of doing it than does the Israeli government. So I support what President Obama's position is on the issue of Iran and its nuclear ambitions. Sanctions are beginning to show some effect. I think we ought to keep ratcheting up those sanctions. And it's, you don't need a crystal ball to understand why these nuclear scientists in Iran are dying. We know why they're dying. And there's nothing wrong with that approach either if you want to keep Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. So I think we're on the right track. When you have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff go out here and publicly say that if Israel bombs Iran's nuclear facilities, it's going to result in a lot of loss of American lives in the region, then I think you have to pay attention to that. In each of the last two administrations, the government of Israel has asked for overflight rights, in-flight refueling capabilities, and bunker-busting bombs. President Bush 43, at the time when you were working there, I think, said, no, that's not in the national interest of the United States. We're not going to give you that. They came to the Obama administration. The Obama administration said the same thing. No, that's not in the national interest of the United States for you to bomb Iranian nuclear facilities. In the first place, we think it'll only delay their getting the bomb. You won't prevent it, and it will create untold consequences in the Middle East, so we're not going to give you those things. Now, I happen to believe that's the right policy. On the other hand, I think we ought to make it very clear to Israel, our strong ally, and by the way, they will always be our strong ally, and we will always have their back, as President Obama said. Make it clear that in the final analysis, if we have to do it, we'll take that stuff out militarily.
We want to go back to German unification, but I can't help but ask this question. The president's opened up a diplomatic window in Iran. We should be in negotiations in the next 30 to 40 days. What's the probability of success? I know this is peering into the darkness with the Iranians because you don't know their style, but is there a possibility that diplomacy could succeed?
I don't know whether there's any possibility. I think I mentioned to you when we were having coffee this morning that when I was a co-chairman of the Iraq Study Group with Lee Hamilton, I asked President Bush 43, I said, I think it might be worthwhile to talk to Iran because you talked to Iran and when you first went into Afghanistan, and they, by the way, they cooperated with you because they didn't want to see an unstable Afghanistan. And I think we ought to, I would like, as chairman of the Iraq Study Group appointed by Congress at your request, to contact the Iranians and say, look, why don't you do the same thing in Iraq that you did in Afghanistan? You have an interest in a stable Iraq and not an unstable Iraq. And he said, fine, you go ahead and talk to them. And I talked to them at the level of the Iranian UN ambassador to the United States. He says, thank you very much for your idea. I will communicate it to my government and I'll get back to you. He came back in a week and he said, we don't want to do anything with you in Iraq because we think your government is committed to regime change in Iran. So we've had that conversation. That's, I guess, the last conversation I know about that we've had with Iran.
Okay, thank you. Yes? Right behind you. Yes, thank you.
You guys will listen.
Hi, Magda Davila, second-year student from the Harvard Business School. After the German reunification, not only you put an end to the Cold War, but also you started a new set of relationships with the Soviet Union. When Iraq-Kuwait started, did you ever fear that your opposed positions would stretch too much that relationship? And in that case, if the stretch was too strong, which one would have you put the interest first? In keeping the relationship and the German reunification going, or on the Iraq-Kuwait issue?
So the question, as I understand it, is that the United States was conducting negotiations with the Soviet Union over German unification, but that as we proceeded into 1990 with the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein August 1st, we then had another big issue with the Soviets.
That's correct.
And so how did you balance those two big issues with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze? And were they in conflict with each other?
We had those two big issues. You're quite right. And let me tell you something very interesting about this international. We're going to talk about this in the next session, but this unprecedented international coalition that we were able to pull together to kick Iraq out of Kuwait. It never would have happened but for this event. I was on August the 1st, I was in Irkutsk, Siberia, negotiating arms control agreements with Edward Shevardnadze, the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, and I received a message from Washington, from the State Department saying, we're really worried about the fact that Iraq is massing troops on the border of Kuwait. You might want to ask your interlocutor there what he knows about that, Soviet foreign minister, because Iraq was a client state of the Soviet Union. So I turned to him, I said, Edward, we're worried about this. What do you think? He said, oh, he wouldn't be so foolish as to do that. And I said, well, our CIA is really concerned about it, and we know there are a lot of troops massing there. You might want to check with the KGB at lunch. We broke for lunch. He came back, He said the KGB said there couldn't be anything to that. He would not be so foolish. And so I flew off, we finished our negotiation, I flew off, I was going to Mongolia because here was the first communist country in Asia that was reforming and embracing democracy and free markets, sandwiched in between the two big communist giants. So I thought it would be important to show the flag there. And I was in Mongolia when the invasion happened. I got on the phone, of course, to the president, but then I also talked to my traveling squad, and we decided we would try by that time we had a really good relationship with Shevardnadze. We were negotiating German unification, that we would try to fly back through Moscow, come back to the United States. I quickly canceled my trip in Mongolia. So we'd fly back through Moscow if he would stand up with me and condemn this invasion of a small country by a big neighbor, even though it was a client state of the Soviet Union. He said he would. And by the way, he did this without ever clearing it with Gorbachev. I got on the airplane, flew to an airport in Moscow, stood shoulder to shoulder, the United States Secretary of State and the Foreign Minister of the Soviet Union, and we condemned the actions of a Soviet client state and proposed an arms embargo on Iraq. That was an extraordinarily fortunate circumstance. That was the beginning of the international coalition that we pulled together to kick Iraq out of Kuwait. Because if the Soviets hadn't been in it, and they could always have vetoed our resolution in the UN Security Council. Right. But so your question is very pertinent, and we managed to handle both of those at the same time, and they were both very important issues.
We have time for maybe 2 more questions. We're going to break it at 2:45. We're going to take a 45-minute break and come back at 3:30. 2 more questions. Yes, all the way in the back right here.
Thank you very much. My name is Bernhard Metz. I'm a student at the Kennedy School, MPA, second year. And my question is on the ally, we don't know if they are British or French, as you mentioned, that was trying to slow down the process with the Soviet Union. So the question is, how did you or who did actually finally manage to appease them, and in which way? So there are some that this ally was kind of bought by the Maastricht Treaty and the European Union, and above all the euro, which decreased the power of Germany. But yeah, the question is, was this really the reason, or was there some other things?
So I'll just restate it for everybody. So in the first 30 days after the wall fell, you had to negotiate with Margaret Thatcher and Francois Mitterrand. And I'll just say this, and it's in some of the readings that I've assigned for my course. We know that Francois Mitterrand went to Kiev and met with Gorbachev in early December of 1989, and he was not exactly with the program of the United States. So you had coalition politics. Before you could really focus on the Soviets and the East Germans, you had to consolidate our positions with Britain and France, our 2 closest allies. Right. How difficult was that?
Well, we had to do that. We had to consolidate our positions with Britain and France, but we had a lot of help. We had help from Helmut Kohl, and I'll tell you why. Helmut wanted to see Germany unified, quite understandably, and Francois Mitterrand wanted to see European monetary union, and they cut a deal. Right? That's what I think. I wasn't in the room, but I would almost bet you that that Helmut Kohl got Francois Mitterrand to agree to German unification if Kohl would agree to economic union in Europe. That meant the Germans, of course, would have to give up their Deutschmark, something they might now be very sorry for. But that's what happened, in my view. So we had a lot of help in bringing the French along, anyway.
And Margaret Thatcher, she's a strong-willed, powerful.
Yeah, but Margaret wasn't going to oppose. She was worried that history would repeat itself. She really was, and she was, at first, rather strongly opposed to German unification at this time. She would have said, we've talked about it for 40 years. and we need to do it, but maybe not right now. Well, after France said okay, and then it was apparent we were beginning to move the Soviets, she wasn't going to say no. She was going to, I think, come along with us, and she did.
So by February of 1990, when you formed the 2+4 talks in Ottawa, you had all the allies behind us.
We got the 2+4 talks agreed to, and I was in Ottawa at the Open Skies Conference, and that's where I negotiated with Douglas Hurd from the UK, Roland Dumas of France, and Edward Shevardnadze of the Soviet Union, and got their agreement to the 2+4.
And you were sure at that time that Kohl and Genscher were also on board that
Yeah, well, we made sure that Kohl and Genscher were on board at that time. You don't want to go into all that, do you? It's in the book.
I got it. Okay. All the way in, Lillian, all the way in the back.
Tell her to speak up. Got a pair of 82-year-old ears down here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Lillian Langford. I'm a third-year student here at the law school and at the Kennedy School. Secretary Baker, you mentioned that although reunification seemed inevitable by the time the wall fell, the actual fall of the wall occurred much faster than anyone expected. And so one of the things that we talk about a lot here in the negotiation program is being always prepared for your negotiation. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about how you were able to just recalibrate, really, the American strategy towards reunification, given this very unexpected and fast event that changed the landscape.
So the question is, essentially, as I understand it, Lillian, one of the important qualities of a negotiator and a diplomat is to be always prepared. You had very little time after November 9th, 1989, to put together a strategy, a team, a tactics to unify all of these countries. Talk about that important element of preparation and discipline, always being perhaps better prepared than anybody else in the room when you enter it.
My life has been guided by a motto that my father gave me at an early age, and it says, it's the 5 Ps, and it says prior preparation prevents poor performance. And that's what I've always believed, and it's a silly little saying, but let me tell you something, it's always served me very well. I mentioned earlier that we were doing studies, we were doing papers and writing studies and things in the State Department as far back as May or maybe even March or April of 1989 about the potential for German unification. And you're quite right that we had a very narrow window of opportunity within which to act. But we acted reasonably quickly, and of course it ended up being effective. But I think I said earlier that it was only February of 90 when Genscher came to the State Department, and we kicked around the idea of how we would do this, and we decided we would do it in 2+4. And by the way, our other NATO allies really didn't like that at all. They raised unshirted hell in London and in Paris and in Washington. They didn't like it that they were not a party to this, but they weren't. We didn't get so much flack from the CSCE because there were 32 countries there, and it didn't really make sense to put it in there. But we had started thinking about German unification as far back as May of '89.
Right. Before we break, Mr. Secretary, I wanted to ask this question. You're talking about prior preparation prevents poor performance. Now I've got it down. Mm-hmm.
You could make it 6 Ps.
One of the things that I noticed about you when I was working at the State Department, I reminded the Secretary of this, the Secretary had to testify before Congress, our committees, Senate Foreign Relations, House International Relations. You had to testify for your confirmation. We would give you these huge briefing books with several hundred issue papers. I remember once we gave you this briefing book on a Friday, and on Monday morning you came back in the office and you had underlined and marked up every single page. So you believe in the 5 Ps, that's for sure. But the discipline and the hard work and just the exhaustion of being Secretary of State, you're flying all over the world, you've got this weight of the world on your shoulders. How did you handle that, and was that a big factor in how you did your job?
I was always taught to do my homework, and what you're talking about on the book is just doing your homework. The job of Secretary of State is very difficult once you get out there and start traveling a lot. It's very debilitating. I think I went to 10 or 12 countries in 2 days, or maybe 3 days, maybe a few more countries, but putting together the coalition to kick Iraq out of Kuwait. And I was on the road all the time. I found something called halcyon, which the doctors came out and said, boy, that's really bad for you. It'll kill you. You should never take it. But boy, it sure worked for me. But of course, another thing that helped was I had a great big 707 with a stateroom in it and a bed, and a lot of Air Force stewards to serve me whatever I needed. The poor staff had to sit in the back of the plane and go to sleep in their chair like this on these long, long flights. But you do have to have a strong constitution. I think